Okay, welcome everybody. Today, our guest speaker, an important speaker, is Alessandro Ferrara. Alessandro Ferrara is professor of political philosophy at the University of Rome Tor Vergata and former president of the Italian Association for Political Philosophy. He has graduated in philosophy in Italy, and later he received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He has conducted postdoctoral research in Germany with Habermas and later at Berkeley again, leading to the publication of his first book, Modernity and Authenticity. He serves as editorial consultant on the board of a number of journals, including Constellation, Philosophy and Social Criticism, and the European Journal of Philosophy, and on the advisory board of a series New Direction in Critical Theory at Columbia University Press. The seminar is about the legacy of John Rawls in our century, and briefly, Ferrara is going to rethink liberal legitimacy, highlighting the originality of Rawls' new normative standard. You have 40 minutes, Professor Ferrara, to present your paper, then we will open the floor for questions and answers. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Gabriele. It's an honor and a pleasure to contribute to this series of seminars. And first of all, a warm thanks to the Center for Advanced Studies of the University of Rijeka, especially to you, Gabriele, for this invitation. And this year marks the 100th anniversary of the birth of John Rawls, one of the greatest political philosophers of our time, perhaps the most creative among those of normative inclination. And so it's a proper moment, I think, to reflect on his legacy in the 21st century, a historical context which is significantly different from the one that inspired his work in the 60s and 70s at the beginning and also later. And in this paper, I develop an argument about the relation of his two main works and try to show how political liberalism contains two important breakthroughs with respect to a theory of justice. So I'll start by briefly outlining the gist of a theory of justice, very briefly, as a foil against which these two major breakthroughs of political liberalism can be assessed. So, as we all know, John Rawls is a man of countless publications, but essentially of two great books, A Theory of Justice of 1971 and Political Liberalism of 1993. These two books differ considerably, as we will see, in the responses that they offer to the following common predicament that cuts across the two. Since modern times, we happen to live in societies in which whatever conflicts may arise between competing interests or rival values are not likely to be solved by appealing to a shared conception of the human good. Therefore, we need a method or a procedure for adjudicating these conflicts in a way acceptable to parties that adopt diverse and often conflicting evaluative standpoints. And furthermore, in both books, Rawls wishes that such method or procedure for resolving conflicts be acceptable to all the parties involved as a matter of principle, or for its reflecting justice, not out of reasons of prudence, or because it is convenient, as in a Hobbesian contract. And justice as fairness is the proper name by which Rawls designates the conception of justice that, in his opinion, can best perform this function. Now, as we all know, widely acclaimed for having reawakened normative political philosophy from a long lethargy, A Theory of Justice reversed a long-standing utilitarian tradition, largely dominant in the English-speaking world, and offered an account of a just society along, instead, deontological Kantian lines. A just society is one whose basic structure reflects just principles. And what principles are just? Reviving and renewing the tradition of the social contract, just principles for Rawls are those which rational actors, deliberating behind a veil of ignorance in the course of a thought experiment called the original position and meant to replace the older state of nature of contract theory, principles that they would select for the purpose of grounding the basic structure of society. And I leave aside here important aspects of Rawls's defense of justice as fairness, like the circumstances of justice, reflective equilibrium, the fact of pluralism, and the veil of ignorance. Just to emphasize that at this stage, deliberation was understood by Rawls to take place within the framework of rational choice. On that basis, according to Rawls, the parties would agree that the basic structure of a just society is best conceived as a structure responsive to two principles. The first principle states that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. And the famous second principle states that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they're both A, to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged, consistent with the just savings principle, and B, attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality and opportunity. And a so-called lexical priority regulates the relation of these two principles. Namely, in a just society, freedom can never be balanced against goods that are not freedom itself. Now, undeniably and breathtakingly innovative though it was, a theory of justice pushed to its extreme limit thanks to the incorporation of the then called fact of pluralism, what nonetheless, in spite of all, still remains a traditional scheme of foundational normative philosophy. If I may take the liberty of using the style of movie reviews, we're offered here a pretty traditional plot. Philosopher sets a normative standard for judging the world, justifies it against competing standards, and expects the rest of us to agree. I will suggest that the core of John Rawls's revolutionary contribution to normative political philosophy consists of his moving beyond the model reconstructed now, and of doing so in a way unequaled by any fellow liberal normative philosophers, notably Habermas and Dworkin. In a theory of justice, or if a theory of justice is outstandingly innovative within a long-established paradigm, political liberalism revolutionizes the paradigm altogether. It offers a view of normativity in line with a new philosophical horizon opened in the first half of the 20th century by Wittgenstein, a horizon that considers futile the exercise of bridging the plurality of locally shared frames of meaning, language games, life forms, and so on, through appealing to some translocal foundation. However, this Wittgenstein-initiated sea change, then reinforced by Heidegger on the continental side of the then operative divide, has resulted over the decades, by and large, in a stalemated philosophical scene, which is populated either by foundationalists like realists, phenomenologists, rational choice theorists, philosophers of mind, and so on, who simply sideline the problem, or by radical contextualists on the other side, radical contextualists in postmodern, post-structuralist, deconstructionist, or post-colonial appearances, who simply give up on context-transcending normativity, and limits their inquiries to reconstructing locally prevailing codes. Political liberalism, instead, breaks that standstill and offers a model of normativity that, like a philosophical beacon, so to speak, extends its lights well beyond political philosophy. Now, in order to clarify why political liberalism achieves that breakthrough, we previously need to answer the question, what was wrong with the theory of justice? At the end of a long transitional period, which lasted through the 1980s, and I cannot address here, two aspects of the account offered in that book, in the Theory of Justice, were found misguided. And we're informed about these two wanting aspects by Rawls himself. The first flaw is mentioned in the original introduction to political liberalism. After distinguishing the fact of pluralism from his newly introduced fact of reasonable pluralism, he observes, and I quote, that the fact of a plurality of reasonable but incompatible comprehensive doctrines shows that, as used in theory, the idea of a well-ordered society of justice as fairness is unrealistic, end of quote. A deep change has occurred in Rawls's argument. And the test case for making sense of the magnitude of such change is utilitarianism. Now, the expectation built in a theory of justice was that the parties in the original position unanimously would discard utilitarian principles of justice in favor of the two principles of justice as fairness, which were just recalled. The new idea, instead, is that insofar as the utilitarian doctrine meets the standard of being reasonable, namely being acceptable to local cooperators, respectful of the burdens of judgment, that doctrine cannot be discarded at all, but must be figured in as one of several comprehensive views that an inclusive political conception of justice, capable of attracting an overlapping consensus, must be compatible with. Now, that's the first flaw. The second flaw is mentioned in footnote 7 of lecture 2 of political liberalism, where Rawls describes in that footnote the idea that the theory of justice is a part of the theory of rational decision as, quote, simply incorrect. The normative notion of the rational certainly deserves a role of its own within a political conception of justice, but justice as fairness, now reconceived as a political conception of justice, tries to give an account, and I quote, of reasonable principles of justice. Differently from what many theorists in the history of political philosophy, from Hobbes to David Gautier, have tried to do, justice as fairness includes, and I quote from Rawls, no thought of deriving those principles from the concept of rationality as the sole normative concept, end of quote. Now, too much, I think, would be missed if we reduced the game-changing quality of political liberalism, what is new in it relative to theory of justice, to the exposure of these two flaws in the previous version of the paradigm. So just a paradigm correction. And to the thesis that justice as fairness is responsive not just to the rational, but also to the reasonable. And I use the adjective revolutionary, not lightheartedly. I submit that its use is justified by the occurrence of two additional innovations, the two breakthroughs mentioned in the title. The first can be captured by the phrase legitimation by constitution, coined by Frank Michelman, and it's the title of a book that we jointly have written and is coming out on the 22nd of this month. The second consists of the introduction of the groundbreaking normative standard of the most reasonable. Let me start with the transformation of liberalism set in motion by legitimation by Constitution. Political liberalism is a complex answer to one question, slightly different from what is a just society, and raised at the beginning of the text. The question is, how is it possible for there to exist over time a just and stable society of free and equal citizens who remain profoundly divided by reasonable religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines? The answer, in a nutshell, is that stability can be combined with just institutions if, first of all, in such a well-ordered society, and I quote from Rawls, everyone accepts and knows that everyone else accepts the very same principles of justice, end of quote, or a publicly recognized political, not comprehensive conception of justice. Secondly, if the basic structure of such society, quote, is publicly known or with good reasons believed to satisfy those principles. And thirdly, if the citizens, quote, generally comply with society's basic institutions, which they regard as just, end of quote. Those three conditions can be met only insofar as an overlapping consensus coalesces and lasts over time, not just for one historical time, but over time, around the core principles of a political conception of justice endorsed by the citizens for principled reasons rooted in their diverse, comprehensive conceptions of the good. Finally, an overlapping consensus must not be confused, Rawls hastens to clarify, with the idea of consensus as used in everyday politics. Differently than the standard practice in politics of seeking compromise by identifying a common denominator that strikes a balance between political rival views and allows them to meet halfway, justice as fairness seeks validation first in a freestanding way by philosophical argument. The original position then finds a new role in political liberalism as a device of representation that enables us to anticipate, to outline such a political conception of justice. And if we do a good constructivist job, we can hope, and no more than just hope, that an overlapping consensus will eventually converge on this view of justice and allow just institutions to achieve not any kind of stability, even fascism can achieve stability, but stability for the right reasons. Even within a well-ordered society, however, having said all this, even in a well-ordered society, the operation of institutions and authority will need to be assessed, because legitimate exercises of coercive power will have to be separated from arbitrary exercises of power. And here is the point where political liberalism enriches the tradition that since John Locke identifies the hallmark of legitimate government with the consent of the governed. In any society, including a well-ordered one, political power is always coercive power, backed up by sanctions. And what distinguishes this legitimate use of force from arbitrary oppression is the perception shared by the citizens, and I quote from Rawls, that political power is ultimately the power of the public. That is, the power of free and equal citizens as a collective body. Now, this may sound like a fine proposition, but it doesn't mean that individually, each one of us can never find oneself in the position of having to suffer under the coercion of a power that operates contrary to what we believe and what we will. we're equal to all other citizens as co-participants in the public formation of a political will through elections. But on the other hand, we're also so-called private citizens who may suffer the effects of a political power that operates in what are for us, to the best of our mind, unjust terms. We may find questionable or unjust some of the statutes enacted by the legislature to which we're subject. We may find unjust some of the executive orders or decrees issued by an administration, or the sentences pronounced by courts. And this universal predicament poses the problem of specifying the criterion according to which specific single exercises of coercive power by state authorities can be considered legitimate and not arbitrary. Now, for that purpose, Rawls formulates the well-known liberal principle of legitimacy, which occurs in several slightly different versions. There are about 5 of them. And in one of the most widely cited versions, he puts it this way: our exercise of political power is proper and hence justifiable only when it is exercised in accordance with the Constitution, the essentials of which all citizens may reasonably be expected to endorse in the light of principles and ideals acceptable to them as reasonable and rational. Now, this account of what legitimate authority means prompts some comments. First, Rawls's formulation speaks to us through what it does not say. The phrase "in accordance with the Constitution" stands over against alternate formulations that have been used in the past and are still on offer. For example, against the idea endorsed by majoritarian, now populist views, and by so-called political constitutionalism. I'm thinking of authors like Bellamy or Waldron or Tushnet. The idea that political authority acts legitimately when it acts in accordance with the will of the majority, as expressed in the latest elections. Furthermore, Rawls's formula requires that the Constitution be endorsed, at least in its essential elements, by all the citizens as free and equal, and on the basis of principles and ideals acceptable to them as reasonable and rational. Consent, in other words, must be based on considerations of justice, as opposed to considerations of prudence. However, Rawls's liberal theory principle of legitimacy is not just a response to rival theories of legitimacy, but is also a response to adverse conditions for democracy that are typical of the 20th and 21st centuries. Some of them are the immense extension of the electorates, numbering millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions in one case, over 1 billion in the case of India. And the immense extension of the electorates encourages so-called rational ignorance, as James Fishkin has called it. Then the institutional complexity of contemporary societies, which negatively affects the accountability of authority. Then the increasing pluralism of contemporary publics, and the anonymous quality of communication processes, those processes whereby public opinion is formed. And then all of these have been highlighted by Frank Michelman in a famous article, How Can the People Ever Make the Laws, of 1997. And then I myself had listed more of these conditions. Starting from the end of the 20th century, we can think of even less propitious conditions for the operation of a democratic regime that have been added to those 4, namely the nativist and populist reaction to new incoming migratory tides the financialization of the economy, then social and political acceleration, the new structural transformation of the public sphere prompted by the social media, the rise and spreading of forms of supranational governance, not always connected with democratic accountability, and the impact of the ever more widespread use of opinion polls upon the perceived legitimacy of the exercise of authority, something that Bruce Ackerman has illustrated quite well in a book of 2010. Considered as a whole, these conditions, so unpropitious for the exercise of the citizens' democratic authorship, puts on the philosophical agenda the necessity of a reconsideration of the classical notion of democratic legitimacy, which has been centered on the consent of the governed. Citizens should no longer be expected, as in mainstream liberalism from Locke on, to endorse all of the details of the legislative, executive, and judicial activity of democratic institutions. We must settle today for less demanding criterion that exempts single outcomes of such activity from direct justification. There will always be, even in a well-ordered society, groups of citizens for whom some verdict, some statute, some executive order counts as unjust and coercive. And yet, the consent of the governed can and must remain the yardstick for assessing the legitimate exercise of democratic authority. And if it can do so, if properly reformulated, as a judgment passed on the constitutional essentials with which all the ordinary legislative, judicial, and executive acts must simply be consistent. Frank Michelman's phrase, legitimation by constitution, captures concisely the gist of Rawls's theoretical innovation, which I'll sum up in the following terms. Given the prohibitive conditions of hyperpluralism, of institutional complexity, anonymity of the communication processes in the public sphere, it makes sense to deflect divisive questions of legislative policy and value. Does this law or policy merit the respect or rather the contempt of a right-thinking person, so Frank Michelman, to a different question? Is this law or policy constitutional? A different question for which the answer is to be publicly apparent, or at any rate ascertainable, by means that are less open to, hopefully, to divisive dispute than the deflected substantive disagreements. Now, the second, and I come to a close here, the second innovation, breakthrough present in political liberalism concerns the normative standard of the most reasonable. The most reasonable may become relevant at any time when we assess a legislative proposal, a pronouncement of a Supreme Court, a constitutional amendment, an outline for the basic structure, a Bill of Rights, and of course, when we debate political conceptions of justice in the light, in search for a suitable grounding for the basic structure. And perhaps the best way to clarify the most reasonable is to go back to the question of what validates justice as fairness as an appropriate normative basis for a just and stable society, and to reconstruct briefly the inner evolution of Rawls's thinking on this matter. In a theory of justice, what makes justice as fairness preferable over utilitarianism and other competing views is the fact that in the original position, rational actors who deliberate behind a veil of ignorance would unanimously find it more rational to ground the basic structure of the future society on its principles. Then, already in 1980, in Kantian constructivism in moral theory, a very important article, which is temporally much closer to a theory of justice than to political liberalism, Rawls jettisons this traditional normative model and thoroughly rethinks the normative credentials of justice as fairness. When he writes that, and here I quote from page 519 of that article, what justifies a conception of justice is not its being true to an order antecedent to and given to us, but its congruence with our deeper understanding of ourselves and our aspirations, and our realization that given our history and the traditions embedded in our public life, it is the most reasonable doctrine for us. Then, in 1993, 13 years later, in Political Liberalism, once again, justice as fairness is vindicated not as the view that rational actors would select from within a basket of competing views, but on the basis of its being, among all the at least reasonable political conceptions of justice, the one most reasonable for us. You'll find that at page 28 in Political Liberalism. Finally, in the new introduction, written for the expanded edition of Political Liberalism, first published in 1996, Rawls takes a further step toward reconciling normativity and reasonable pluralism by imagining that a liberal democratic society may be home to what he calls, and I quote, a family of reasonable liberal political conceptions of justice, some of which may be mutually incompatible with one another. However, in the context of a plurality now, no longer a plurality of reasonable comprehensive conceptions of the good, but also a plurality of political conceptions of justice, all by definition reasonable, justice as fairness is still considered by Rawls most reasonable on account of its best satisfying relative to its competitors, for example, relative to political versions of utilitarianism that we can think of, or Habermasian type discursive deliberative democracy, or republicanism. It's on account of its best satisfying relative to these competitors' three conditions. Namely, allowing for the specification of certain rights, liberties, and opportunities, B, entailing a special priority for these freedoms, and C, including measures assuring all citizens adequate all-purpose means to make effective use of their liberties and opportunities. Now, my question then is, why is this normative benchmark, the most reasonable, so important? Because it breaks a philosophical spell that has entrapped normative political philosophy in the West for over 24 centuries, since the time when Plato formulated his allegory of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic, and it inaugurates a new perspective which still awaits full elaboration. Now, as we all know, Plato's allegory narrates of an underground cave where prisoners chained to their benches face a wall onto which shadows are projected by objects lit by a fire positioned behind them. Shadows are all that the prisoners see and are misperceived as the whole of reality, a form of belief that symbolizes shifting and ungrounded opinion. One of the prisoners frees himself, succeeds in reaching the outside world, and painfully, slowly acquires true knowledge of the objects and the sun, the source of all light. He decides to return inside and inform his fellow cave dwellers, only to be derided for failing to discern now the contours of the shadows because his sight is temporarily impaired by the sudden transition from full daylight to the penumbra of the cave. He even risks being killed when he tries to unbind his comrades in order to enable them to take the same journey. Now, many metaphysical, moral, philosophical, anthropological meanings have been associated with Plato's allegory of the cave, but its political philosophical significance is that truly entitled to legitimately rule over others is only the one individual taken as representative of the class of the philosophers who has had the courage to leave opinion or doxa, which prevails inside the cave, and to endure the suffering that accompanies the quest for true ideas, and later the pains of violent rejection when he tries to offer to his fellows an account of how things truly are and what the good is. So legitimate rule is ultimately rooted in the supremacy of knowledge or episteme over mere opinion or doxa. As Hannah Arendt first noted, the grounding of legitimate rule on the possession of true knowledge, which is the enduring legacy of Plato's allegory of the cave, contains a dangerous ambiguity. On the one hand, the allegory embeds a far-reaching, critical, anti-traditionalist, anti-conventional teaching. On the other hand, though, it contains a seed of authoritarianism, lodged in the primacy of solitary seeing over action in concert or joint self-definition, and anchored that seed of authoritarianism in the subordination of politics to ethics, the idea of the good, or in the modern secularist version of the allegory of the caves, think of Marxism and the social Darwinism inaugurated by Herbert Spencer, the subordination of politics to some law-like, non-political sort of truth. The over 24 centuries elapsed since Plato's time had added countless variations on this theme, but have left this deep-seated overall teaching basically unchallenged. The idea of the good, symbolized by the sun, has over time been replaced by the revealed will of a monotheistic God, by insights into the desiring nature of man, by the laws of evolution, by reason in history, by the dynamics of class struggle. The constant element underlying all these variations is the idea of that true knowledge which precedes intersubjective deliberation and sets the standard for sorting out good and bad deliberation, provides the foundations for the legitimate use of coercive power, for political obligation, and for all the normative concepts found in politics. Now, the latest reincarnation of this epistemic approach to normative political philosophy is justice as fairness, as understood in a theory of justice. It is the weakest possible version of Plato's allegory, topographically located at the extreme edge, beyond which the model undergoes radical transformation. In fact, within a theory of justice, the fact of pluralism is already part of the circumstances of justice. The point of justice as fairness is to enable us to build a just polity amidst conflicting conceptions of the good, and ultimately, for Rawls, it is the consensus of us inside the cave that validates the philosopher's argument, a premise that Plato would have never endorsed. However, a theory of justice still lies within the bounds of Plato's line of thinking because it incorporates the expectation, later denounced as unrealistic, as we've seen in political liberalism, that everybody in the cave will eventually recognize the superiority of justice as fairness over all the rival accounts of what is outside the cave, notably over utilitarianism, as though the burdens of judgments could be fully neutralized by some philosophical argument. It is against the foil of this epistemic understanding of normative validity and legitimacy. It comes down to a kind of mental cramp that we all have, thinking that right things are right ultimately because they reflect truth. Against the foil of this epistemic understanding of normative validity, that we can assess the magnitude of the revolutionary innovation introduced by Rawls when he qualifies justice as fairness as being binding for us, not because it is true to an order of things antecedent to and given to us, as the world of objects out there, out of Plato's cave, but because it is congruent with a deeper understanding of ourselves and our aspiration. And in light of our history and traditions, it is the most reasonable for us. Now, I end with the attempt to clarify in what sense this expression, the most reasonable for us, can be taken to count not as an outright negation of the allegory of the cave, say along the skeptical lines intimated, among others, by Machiavelli and Hobbes, but as an enriching supplement, a further development of the allegory of the cave. And in order to clarify that sense, all we have to do is to imagine that not just one, but a group of people, of philosophers destined to rule the cave is heading back from the outside world. And let me point out that this is not a kind of fictional interpretation of Plato's text, because there is an anchoring to this imagery in some passages a few pages after the enunciation of the allegory, where Plato has Socrates and Glaucon debate implications of the allegory based on the assumption that several captives leave the cave and then return. Glaucon asks Socrates, are we not committing injustice to them by expecting that they return back to the cave? They're speaking in the plural. All right. Then, as in the original version, these philosophers want to report what they've seen and to reform life in the cave. Wouldn't they perhaps want to stop on their way back at the entrance of the cave and consult in order to exchange impressions and check if they can come up with a common story that then one of them, as their spokesperson, would relate? And if during that conversation, neither fully inside or outside the cave, the debate dragged on without coming to a close, wouldn't our philosophers most likely agree to limit their report to the observations blessed by full overlap, and to take the convergent parts of their account as the only basis for exercising legitimate authority once back in the cave? As to the contentious conclusions and observations, wouldn't they agree to ban their enforcement through the authority that each of them might happen to wield in the cave, and leave these contentious parts up for further discussion in proper venues for the purpose of possibly extending the area of agreement? Of course they would. These are rhetorical questions, but let us now step back and reflect on what these philosophers are doing. Should we describe their endorsing the prohibition to legally enforce controversial parts of the account so that none of the accounts may triumph or succumb in the cave due to the purely contingent distribution of power as just another opinion, like the ones they were exchanging about the passing shadows? Certainly not, we would have to admit. And should we alternatively then describe the philosopher as endorsing the prohibition never to back up controversial principles through coercive power as a principle that they found, they discovered in the outside world as objectively as they discovered the light of the sun? Hardly so, a contemporary Glaucon would have to admit. We would have then to concede that the philosophers, during their conversations sideways at the entrance of the cave, associate their pluralism stance neither with doxa nor with episteme, but simply they associate that pro-pluralist stance with the most reasonable thing for them to do. What Rawls would call the most reasonable principle for ruling the cave available to them through their common public reason. So in the course of their consultation sideways at the entrance of the cave, on the way back, the philosophers can be said to have given rise to public reason and its twin standards, the reasonable and the most reasonable. If so, then the normativity of what is most reasonable for us, be it a political conception of justice or a legislative proposal or whatever, rests not on epistemic ground, as though its merits were discovered outside the cave, but on the judgments that the deliberating subjects form upon reflection. At the location sideways at the entrance of the cave symbolizes that the most reasonable, as a normative concept, somehow partakes of two worlds. The imperfect nature of the subject of justice, us, and the ideal quality of justice, and combines them in the best mix for one singular case. Now, one predecessor of this exemplary, uniqueness affirming normativity is Rousseau's account of the legislator in the social contract. In chapter 8 of the second book of the social contract, the legislator who advises the deliberating citizens, so Rousseau, should not aim at having them adopt laws good in themselves. This is a quote from Rousseau, but rather at laws fit for the people eventually subject to them. So Rousseau's intimation for the constitution-making power of the citizens here is unequivocal. Do not author constitutional laws that you're not fit to be respectful of. This intimation does not imply that the selection of the basic structure is unprincipled, prudential, or just a projection of the preferences of the constitution maker. Rather, it means that the citizens should balance principal optimality, which for Rousseau, let me recall it, means being guided by the very point of the social contract, namely to protect the person and property of each associate while leaving her as free as before. And for Rawls, that means guided by justice and fairness, to balance this principal optimality with the historical experiences and political cultures of the people to be constituted together as a demos. Rawls, furthermore, beyond Rousseau, offers reflective equilibrium as a methodological resource for making sense of when that balance has been achieved. Now, the normativity of justice as fairness, then, in this new picture, grounded in political liberalism and absent from theory of justice, derives not from its being the outcome of a decontextualized thought experiment, but from its being the most reasonable political conception of justice for us, where most reasonable means that among all the merely reasonable conceptions, it is the one that realizes the best fit tested through reflexive equilibrium between its two freestandingly valid principles introduced at the beginning, which simply have changed status, not substance, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the historical, political, cultural features salient for the people who intend to constitute a political community. So to recap, the gist of Rawls's legacy in the 21st century consists of a novel approach to justice and legitimacy that lives up to the 20th century intuition embedded in the linguistic turn inaugurated, among others, by Wittgenstein, about the untenability of Archimedean points, supposedly overranking the local normativity of plural life forms, language games, or in Rawls's own vocabulary, acknowledges the fact of reasonable pluralism, and yet, nonetheless, remains as fully normative as the standards of the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ferrara, for your lecture. You talk about, I think, key issues for our liberal democratic society. Do my colleagues have any question? Maybe while we are waiting for question, I'd like to ask you one. Talking about our century, our times, the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified some democratic troubles. For instance, the growing polarization. It seems to be that groups like no virus, no mask, no vax, and so on, are going to extremes, and maybe, but this is my opinion, that they challenge reasonable pluralism and also consent, for fundamental consent. What do you think about this? How should political liberalism deal with this issue?
Thank you, Gabriele. It's a very timely question and hard to answer. If I had the answer, I would be running in elections as a candidate. But of course, the pandemic has raised powerful challenges to democratic publics all over the world, but it has also brought, that's the positive note, if I can use this term, in such a tragic context, it has also brought a new awareness of the crucial importance of state institutions. There is not a single, out of 195 countries in the world, there's not a single political space, political context, where anyone, be it the public or the government, advocates leaving the distribution of vaccines to the market. Nowhere. Nowhere can you see that. So even the most zealots, the zealots of neoliberalism had to concede that the market is not the most effective instrument for distributing such a vital, life-preserving good. And for us Democrats, it's an opportunity to rebuild trust in democratic institutions somehow. Having said that, then the bad news is that, but this is not to be, I don't think it is to be attributed to the pandemic. It's something that pre-existed the pandemic, and the pandemic has only exacerbated. We have watched over the past 10 years an upsurge of a kind of populist sentiment. We can go into that, a populist sentiment that has resulted in a polarization of our public spaces. And that's a real threat to democracy. Not the ideas of populism as such, but the polarization that they bring about. The fact that the public sphere loses the orientation, which is key in the reconstruction that Habermas has offered us of this concept. The key aspect of the public sphere is the fact, first, that no one owns it, no one can maneuver the public sphere, but it's the resultant of a number of forces. Some are political, public, others are private, and so on. But the important thing is that the subtext of the public sphere is an interrogation, is communal interrogation on what is best for us, what we should do, and the challenge that has began with this upsurge of populism, and the pandemic has strongly exacerbated because of the crucial life-threatening aspects of the issue, is the fact that you lose that orientation, and instead the public sphere is degraded to a public space where you question the legitimacy of the opponent, where the opponent has no business, no credibility, no merit, doesn't belong in the same political sphere as you are. So you demonize the opponent, and in the least vicious, let's say in the most optimistic but yet very tragic development I can see, if the public sphere may turn into a public space like the stadium. The stadium is a place where you go, and even if nothing happens, no hooligans, no clashes, no political violence, still, it is a space where you go there not to exchange reasons, but to exchange expressive acts. Up for my friends, down for the other, the opponents. There's no exchange, no building of any argument or consent on there. And that is the major threat that democracy is facing. And of course, the challenge is how you rebuild, how you backtrack from that degeneration into a polarized space. Sometimes it's only the public sphere. Sometimes, in the worst case, it's also state institutions that get polarized. Parliaments, even courts, get polarized through in this way, and it becomes difficult to exchange reasons. And now, political liberalism. How can politicalism contribute to that? I think it's one section of politicalism that has to do with the ethos, with the democratic ethos, and the way of implementing that. Working on that, we can contribute somehow to answering the question: how can we go back from polarized public spaces back to cooperative public spheres?
Thank you. The stadium metaphor is very interesting.
The stadium metaphor is not to demonize the stadium, not necessarily a home to hooligans, even if they're nice people, but these nice people go there just to cheer their friends and boo their opponents. There's nothing else.
Yeah. Professor Baccarini, Marco Luca, Andrea Colombo, do you have other questions?
Yes, Professor Baccarini raised his hand, but it'd be great to hear from him.
Yeah, so can I? So thank you very much for your, excuse me, too many reactions. I wanted to lower the hand. So thank you very much for your really very interesting and excellent talk. Very much informative and also very interesting in shaping in less than 1 hour the complexity of Rawls' thought. I would like just to ask 2 very small questions. Well, perhaps the second is not so small. So the first regards the novelty of Rawls in political thought that you remarked. I mean, when you said that for Rawls, the legitimacy is not to be found in the truth of the principles of justice or the right, but instead of them being expressive of our reasonableness. So my question is how much this is really a novelty by thinking back to Kant, because it seems to me that even Rawls himself very strongly and very clearly and explicitly pays tribute to Kant and recognizes his depths, which is visible in various things Rawls has written, but really very much visible in his lectures on the history of moral philosophy, where it seems that he really reconstructs Kant as a previous stage of what he later on developed as his political philosophy. So this is the exegetical question. The second is more practical, and again, like Gabriele, I would like to go in the direction of thinking about Rawls in the COVID age. So when we speak about public legitimacy and Rawls, and we relate this to the theory of public reason, which obviously refers to freestanding political values and ideals. But in this COVID time, what appears as really pressing is also scientific reasons as valid public reasons. And Rawls, in fact, has written something about this. When he describes the list of public reasons, he mentioned also conclusions and methods of science when these are not controversial, which seems an important suggestion that I think we must have in mind. And clearly this COVID age shows that we must have in mind something like this. However, it seems deficitary from an important standpoint that it is very strict. In a sense, like I said, it's, and like Rawls wrote, it's more important than what I said. Like Rawls wrote, it's conclusions and methods of science when these are not controversial, which clearly has a rationale in Rawls' thought. And the thought is to have public justification based on reasons that all reasonable people can share. However, in this way, it seems that we come to, let's say, at least a serious question to the theory of public reason in general. And it's the fact that this case of the employment of scientific reasons show that sometimes we need and urgently need reasons that are controversial among reasonable persons, because as this COVID time shows, we need to make decisions. Decisions must be urgent, and still in time when there is disagreement even among the best scientists in the world. So my question is whether you think that we must go on with Rawls' view about conclusions or methods of science when these are not controversial, which is most clearly loyal in relation to the rationale for public reason related to his conception of legitimacy. Whether we can find place in this conception of legitimacy, at this actually is to introduce also the possibility of reasons that are controversial among scientists, or this time, COVID time, put some pressure to think, to rethink about, in fact, about the Rawlsian conception of legitimacy that requires acceptability for all reasonable persons. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Also, thank you, Elvio. This is also challenging questions. The exegetic one, sure. Rawls starts from a placing his political philosophical thinking in the Kantian tradition, but I must say you have there reaching back to a view of validity, a Kantian view of validity, which is more, if I were to say, linked with the third critique than the second critique, with the singularity of the kind of reflective judgment that Kant works out in the first part of the critique of the power of judgment. If you want to look at the two works, Theory of Justice and Political Liberalism, you can see that a theory of justice is closer to the second critique somehow. So, it shares, the mechanism is different, of course, but it shares the ambition to give you a method, a rule of thumb, if you want, on a more modest scale, for saying which is the right way of thinking the just society or the just basic structure, like Kant would have through the categorical imperative for saying whether a maximal action can be recommended or not. So you can work that out. Rational people would agree that justice and fairness is better than utilitarianism and is better than other forms. That's the ambition. And with the most reasonable for us, which immediately evokes the companion idea of most reasonable for them, given that we live in a plural world, and also we can assess the legitimacy of past orders. Otherwise, if you're like a liberal zealot, you come to the conclusion that that the world was always, the political world was always governed by the likes of pirates up until liberalism came about with just institutions. So most reasonable for us, most reasonable for them. And this is closer to the idea of what is exemplary. Kant used the term beautiful because he was dealing with aesthetics there in the third critique, but it's something that is valid but undemonstrable. So you cannot coerce anyone under penalty of being irrational to agree with you. It's something that it's a different kind of singular judgment that has a normative content and yet cannot be the object of demonstration. And yet there is a point. It's not preference, because preference is something for which it's pointless to argue. De gustibus non est disputat. It's pointless to debate that, but it's not pointless. It's meaningful to debate on whether a work of art deserves to be called a work of art, or whether something is most reasonable for us relative to something else. So that combination of there being a normative point without that normative point being demonstrable in the guise of a method or a syllogism or somebody being forced to agree, that's something that Rawls inherits from Kant, but the Kant of the third critique rather than the Kant of the second critique. And the great merit is to think politics along those lines, which I don't think Kant did. To build his later political philosophy, the political philosophy of political liberalism, on that basis. And there are these glimpses in Rousseau, for instance. In Rousseau, there's the tension between the general will in the earlier passages of the social contract, and then the legislator. The legislator is like the representative of reasonability there. So of this balancing of principal optimality, as I said, and on the other hand, the context within which that's. But so Rawls did not invent it. That you're right, he inherited that, but he used it for constructing a political philosophy that is responsive to the problems raised by Wittgenstein and Heidegger on another side, and that created the philosophical predicament in which we are immersed. Okay, to the second one, yes, scientific reason as when it's not, when its findings are not controversial. Sure, the reasonable applies to science as well, in the sense that these scientific truths are non-controversial when they're within the same paradigm. Then we agree, and we look at the world, and the world answers our questions. But when we start from different premises, when the burdens of judgment makes us look at different paradigms as being more or less promising, there we look at the world, and the world says one thing to the supporter of one paradigm, and it says another thing to the supporter of another paradigm. So we're back to square one. And this might be the situation which you mentioned with COVID. We see disagreement among scientists, and what should we do? And what should we do when the burdens of judgment point to those discrepancies? And certainly, if the scientists do not agree, how could we be expected to come to a consensus? And yeah, that's a new challenge. I think then there, the answer that we could gain speculating on what Rawls would have said in political liberalism, from the angle of political liberalism, is that certainly we want to stay true to the idea of reasonability, and build communal responses only on those parts that are accepted, on which there's overlap. And if that is not technically feasible, because then you have to reckon with the facts of the world. So what is shared among the scientists may not be enough to outline a policy for public health or not. Then over that, you may have to find it most reasonable to resort to majority principle. I would say that how I would respond. Any other thing would be technocratic or a technocratic authoritarianism. So also a society, a polity may find it most reasonable to offer most of the possible means, economic, institutional, organizational, whatever, to the scientists in order that they increase the area of overlap and come to increase that area, and therefore offer us a platform for consensual policies. That's also would be most reasonable for us to do, but certainly not go for unilaterally self-proclaimed scientific truths that are not grounded on that reasonable consent, I would say. Yeah, that's new. Yeah, that's entirely new, that kind of, because disagreement among scientists used to be good for universities, good for scientific associations, not problematic for policymaking.
Marco Luca.
Tena raised her hand. Yes, am I right? I mean,
right, yes. Hi, everybody.
Thank
from
you.
the fellows room. My name is Tena Prelec. I'm abusing of Roswitha's account. So you see my name displayed like that. Thank you very much, Professor Ferrara, for your really interesting lecture. I was very interested in the way that you critiqued the concept of stability as something that is uncontroversially good. Of this idea that you reported about stability for the right reasons, and basically, if I understood well, of the importance of the public to feel ownership over the political process in order for stability to be healthy, because otherwise we can have also unhealthy, forms of stability. And I was wondering if we can take that to the realm of foreign politics. I'll explain what I mean. So specifically, the region with which this center is concerned with, Southeastern Europe, has been at the receiving end of a type of foreign policy from the EU, for instance, which was very much, I would say, about preserving an unhealthy type of stability. of privileging, discussions with and keeping in power corrupt leaders who also to some extent use issues of nationalism to preserve a veneer of stability, and in this way, to garner sort of support from the West, from certain Western powers to keep their rule. In the long run, of course, the stability is in no way good for democracy, and we're seeing even instability coming out of this, proposed stability. For instance, in Bosnia in these days, we have, near authoritarianism in Serbia right now. We have a situation in Montenegro in which there has been, state capture and entrenched corruption for 30 years, and there is some movement now. So, I was wondering, can we do that? Can you sort of elaborate on the possibility of expanding this concept to the realm of foreign policy? And could we say that in its modern day application, political liberalism basically has a sort of hypocrisy, between the domestic realm and the foreign policy realm in this sense? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I don't think it needs to have that gap between the domestic emphasis on stability for the right reasons and then neglecting that in foreign. It doesn't need to. It may have that in the personality of leaders or the pressure of political groups that run governments and display that kind of gap. But there's no intrinsic necessity. But there are two. I would answer that there are two distinct standpoints when it comes to stability for the right reasons. To explain the term, stability for the right reasons means stability because people are convinced that the thing which is stable, be it an institutional order or anything, is stable, deserves our consent because it is just, as opposed to deserves our consent because it's the best we can have, and God knows what will happen if we don't offer our consensus. So for reasons of prudence, caution. All right. So stability for the right reasons means giving consensus to some institutional setup because we think it's right. It reflects right principles as opposed to it's prudent for us. And so there's one, when you take the world as an object, as a political object composed of 195 countries, then it is an interest of the world as this composite entity, of course, to have stability for the right reasons. Even though the subjecthood, the subjectivity of this humankind, of all of us, is still far from being politically expressed, active, but it exists as a point of view. We can reason from that standpoint. Somebody, a friend of mine, writing a book on Kant's cosmopolitanism, and he said there's a standpoint of humanity's general will, to use Rousseau's term. So we can think what would be the general will of the humanity if we could imagine that. We could reason about what that could be, about climate change or stability, again, in political terms, defeating terrorism and all sorts of other things. That's the standpoint of the world as such, and of stability for the right reasons, for reason of just, because the relations among the units of the world are pervaded, reflect just principles of coexistence as opposed to a balance of power. Okay, so the Cold War, the word of the Cold War was a stable world, no war. Many people have nostalgia actually for that world because it was really stable, but it was the balance of terror, as it was called, right, of nuclear holocaust. And so it was not for the right reasons. It was just a prudential kind of stability. that's the standpoint of the world. Then a single actor, that could be even a major country, the United States or China, or I wish the European Union was an actor as such, but assuming that it was, this is the standpoint of an actor. And I would say then you come to the realm of politics rather than theory. And I would say that it's a political action inspired by some theory would lead any actor to invest in stability for the right reasons, and therefore to abstain from supporting the kind of local situation that you were referring to in Southeast Europe or in other parts of the world. So avoid buttressing those forces and kinds of local stability, because they don't contribute to stability for the right reasons on a global scale. And stability for the right reasons is also more stability in Rawlsian grounds. I mean, on Rawlsian grounds, stability is a more stable kind of stability. That is the opposition that you find in political liberalism between overlapping consensus and modus vivendi. Why do we prefer an overlapping consensus over a modus vivendi? Because a modus vivendi is more unstable in the end. If one of the actors, one of the parties that agrees to a modus vivendi achieves invulnerability, namely the motivation of modus vivendi being protecting oneself from one's own vulnerability. And if one of the actors achieves invulnerability, or thinks he achieves invulnerability along technical lines through some kind of military weapon or weaponry, or politically because of a strong ally, then that actor loses interest in the preservation of the agreement. So stability for the right reasons is more stable than stability as such. And it's also an enlightened kind of perspective on the part of single actors to support locally forces that go in the direction, act in the direction of stability for the right reasons rather than not, because that's a contribution also to their own chances to live in a more stable world. That's how I would see it. But then, I mean, again, it's short-term interest. Some people, there's history there. History meaning ties, special ties, long-term historical relations between elites that play a distorting role. But I would say, yes, there's nothing in principle that stands in the way of a single actor within the larger global world to support stability for the right reasons on a local basis here and there, wherever the reach of its foreign policy goes. Yeah, that's the best I can do.
Thank you so much. It's a good segue to this morning's talk by my boyfriend, who said we should candidate the nuclear bomb for the Nobel Peace Prize. I was like, okay, this is early in the morning for these thoughts, but it was definitely a sign of things to come during today's discussion. Thank you again, Professor Ferrara.
Thank you, Tina. If there are no other questions, maybe we can close.
We have one more question from Marian.
Marian.
She has a hand.
Marian,
please.
Hi. You have to unmute yourself, Marian. We can hear.
Yes. I'm sorry. Hello, Alessandro, and thanks for the wonderful talk, as inspiring as always. And I'll just ask a brief question because I don't want to take up much time. We've discussed this before. When you mentioned Rousseau, what came to my mind was that you also dealt a lot with the issue of the normative force of identity conceived in terms of personal authenticity. And what I was wondering is also when you mentioned during the talk that nowadays societal conditions are good for Rawls's conception of political liberalism, insofar as we are living in a sort of a post-metaphysical era in which we come to endorse certain normative worldviews, not so much on the ground that we believe in their truth in terms of epistemological realism, but because they come to resonate with us in the sense of how we understand our deepest self, our deepest needs. Now, what I was wondering is if this is on one hand a good condition for political liberalism, because it allows us to have a certain kind of ironic distance, as Richard Rorty would say, with respect to the normative worldviews we endorse. On the other hand, it seems to me that this kind of vacuum that is now left by the disenchantment of the world is being filled in with what can be said the logic of authenticity, in the sense that we also endorse these personal these worldviews because we conceive of them as parts of our authentic selves. And can that also be an obstacle in terms of our ability to accept other worldviews as equally reasonable and equally legitimate? Because if we endorse a certain worldview out of a certain kind of sense of our authenticity, and if this worldview becomes a part of our identity, we also have to not just hold these beliefs, but perform them in a public space. And it seems to me that this is one of the reasons why we have such a polarized political space nowadays, that we are not prepared to accept the reasonability of other standpoints, because this would compromise our sense of personal authenticity. And this is how we come to the football stadium public space metaphor. So what would you make, how do we make room for this force of the ideal of authenticity within political liberalism? Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Marian. The ironic distance, yes, in a way, accepting the burdens of judgment is recognizing or adopting an attitude of ironic distance towards our cherished truths and beliefs. Differently than Rorty, though, it's nice to highlight the difference there between Rorty. Rorty praised, as you well know, political liberalism, the Rawlsian turn, and saying, "Oh, we finally saw the light," in the famous piece by Rorty, "The Priority of Democracy over Philosophy." Okay, but the key difference is that Rorty, nowhere in Rorty's work can you find any equivalent, or can you extrapolate any equivalent of the most reasonable for us. You have a succession of vocabularies, as he puts it, vocabularies that help us deal with the world, and we slide from one to another kind of mysteriously, because there's nothing in the world that really can make us prefer one over the other as such, or force us to abandon one and go to the other. And there's no sense where you can get in Rortian hyper-pragmatist contextualism, how you can get any sense of one of these vocabularies in the plural being more reasonable for us to adopt than another. So in Rawls you get exactly that context sensitivity plus keeping the normative standpoint, which is because other people have the normative standpoint, but then lose sight of that, don't have that context sensitivity. They postulate some universal kind of the value of equality, the supreme value of working, the force of the better argument, Habermas, as though the burdens of judgment didn't matter. So the view of pluralism in Habermas is very traditional, would say, why do we have this opposite views? Because we discuss under suboptimal conditions, and the force of the better argument is not able to come up. All right, but then, Marian, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Something's wrong with the camera. I'm sorry.
That's the screen. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the logic of authenticity, and does it stand in the way? Now, I think the problem is there, not the logic of authenticity per se, namely the idea that our normative ideas must be anchored ultimately in something that we want to make true of ourselves. Not that it is true ourselves factually, because lots of things are factually true about ourselves that have no normative standing. Actually, we should get away from, we should reform ourselves. But things that we must be anchored in something that we want to commit ourselves to. And the problem with the you say authenticity and polarization is the fact that people lose sight of toleration on the one hand and the burdens of judgment on the other. Namely, they lose sight of the fact that their authenticity is not all there is in the world. There's also the authenticity of other people, that free and equal citizens, fellow citizens that should be kept into account. So what is to be blamed is the unreasonableness of disregarding the burdens of judgment, not the claims of authenticity. In my opinion, that's what we can raise the question: what leads to that kind of backsliding into neglecting the burdens of judgment, losing sight of them, thinking that our presumed authentic claims are all there is to it. And the other thing is that we have to distinguish between political authenticity and non-political authenticity. So let me, for those who are not Italian here, recall that in our Constitution, one of key articles that somehow is perceived as grounding the political identity of the country is Article 11, that says Italy repudiates war as a means for settling international controversies, blah, blah, blah. You know, that's that Italy repudiates war. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with claiming that this is an ingredient of the authentic Italian political identity. We would stop being the same republic if parties started questioning that and say, hey, maybe it's not a good idea to repudiate war. Let's rethink, let's reconsider. Maybe there's something to be said for war. That would be the end of it. That's unrenounceable. But there's nothing wrong with that type of authenticity. The authenticity which stands in the way of achieving a stability for the right reasons is the authenticity of partial identities in there, where the true ethnic Italians, and we don't want to mix up with other non-Italians who come from the south of the world and migrate here, and all that's a partial kind of thing that stands in the way, of the democratic game. So when we assess the emphasis on authenticity there, we have to distinguish political authenticity, namely identity features that are most reasonable for us. Then there are three landmark constitutional essentials in this constitution. Italy is called a republic founded on labor. Also, it is called a duty of the republic to remove the obstacles that stands in the way to the full development of the person. And third, Italy repudiates war. These three together, they form a certain configuration that allows different constituencies to all the viciously opposed constituencies in Italy to live under the same thing. But if you question those, then the possibility of that stability for the right reason goes. So authenticity does not stand in the way of achieving coexistence if it is that kind of political authenticity. Namely, that's the ground for saying that something is most reasonable for us. When we say policies, most reasonable for us means most reasonable with who we are in those political terms. These three things: founded on labor, the full development of the person, repudiating war. That's the way. There's nothing wrong with authenticity as a political overlapping subscription to certain values, I think. But the authenticity that stands in the way is the other one, is the non-political one.
Okay, the lecture and also the debate have been very, very rich. So I would like to thank everybody for the participation. Of course, Alessandro Ferrara for his time, for the interesting talk, and the Center of for Advanced Studies for the opportunity. Thank you, everybody, and have a nice day.
Thank you to you. It's been very nice to speak to you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Take care.